What if you had a guide who could tell you how to bridge a gap between who you are today and who you're destined to be? What if each week you could hear a story of someone who has tried and succeeded, or perhaps tried and failed, but learned something in the process? Limitless Spirit is a weekly podcast where host Helen Todd interviews guests about topics and personal stories on defining life's purpose, pursuing personal growth, and developing a deeper faith in Christ.
I guess I got nodules so bad in my throat that I had gone to the doctor and they were like, you're going to need surgery. It's so bad that you're going to have surgery, which means you can't talk for 6 weeks. You can't sing for over a year. I was about 18, 19 years old. And in my mind, I had just decided, well, if I'm going to have to take that much time off and I'm going to lose everything anyway, then I might as well just not do the surgery. And that'll just kind of be the end of that part of my life. So I kind of went through a period where I was, obviously depressed and just spent some time kind of not in a great place. I definitely wasn't walking closely with the Lord. I didn't blame him, but at the same time, I just was kind of in that, I don't understand how he could let this happen if this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Sometimes God has a calling on our lives that we don't recognize and perhaps don't even want. But in his infinite love, God has a way of rearranging our lives to bring this calling to surface and make it very clear. Then we have a choice to accept it or to reject it. Welcome to this episode of the Limitless Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Helen Todd. My guest on this episode is LeAnn Remmers, who at a very early age discovered she had a talent for singing. She dreamt of a career as a singer and had a very promising start with the opportunities to pursue record labels and to go on tours. But at 19 years old, she found out that she had vocal damage that would require surgery and at least a year without singing, which could end her musical career. It seemed like her dream was gone, and the pain of it caused her to drift away from God. LeAnn tells her story and shares how God reached out to her to show her that he had a different plan for her life and that his calling gave her everything she had ever dreamt of. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Limitless Spirit Podcast. Hello, LeAnn. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit Podcast. How are you?
I'm doing so good. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited for us to talk. I'm excited to get to know more about you. I do want to say that I have been blessed twice by your worship at our Greater Purpose Conference. And I look forward to you leading worship again in 2023. And I think when a person meets you, even if they don't know much about you, it's absolutely clear that worship is God's gift that was bestowed upon you. It's more than just having a great voice. It's having the heart set on worship. And so I think it's very fascinating. It's a unique gift. It's a rare gift. Although we're all worshipers, we're all created to be worshipers, but leading in worship, that's something very special and is not really given to many. So I'm assuming that has been probably an important part of your journey in Christ.
It has absolutely been an important part of my journey. It actually wasn't anything that I ever expected, even as a child. I mean, I grew up singing and performing actually secularly, but worship and stuff like that wasn't. We did sing in church whenever I was younger, but it looked a lot different than it does today. So it was just kind of getting up and singing to accompaniment tracks and, things like that. But never thought that I would be like pursuing, ministry and a life in like serving in worship in the local church and leading people and stuff. So that was a huge out of the blue thing that came later on in life, which I'm so thankful for. And I've really enjoyed coming and leading for you guys over the past couple of years. I've loved it. And it's just been such a blessing and an honor to be invited back even for next year.
So let's talk about that. How does a person from a singer, a musician, becomes a worshiper of God? What was it, a certain event, or it was a gradual thing?
No, it was a specific thing. Like I said, I grew up singing in church with my family. My dad was a pastor, and so we would travel around and go visit other churches, and we actually would all sing together as a family. But it wasn't something that I ever thought about doing. It was just something that I did for fun. And I liked doing it. And because I did sing outside of the church, it was just another avenue for me to come in and be able to sing for people. And it always, I guess, held like a little bit of a special place in my heart, but it wasn't something that I thought I was going to do all the time. And so I grew up singing country music and touring and pursuing, record deals and things like that.
So let me ask you a quick question. So as a pastor's daughter, what was your personal relationship with Jesus? I mean, sometimes we assume that a child born into a family of ministry leaders, sort of a shoe-in, that they become Christians and ministry leaders in turn. But 90% of the time, it doesn't happen like that in life. I mean, there's a good reason for this term PK, preacher's kid. So what was your faith journey?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's kind of just assume that when you're born into that's just the path that you're going to take. And I actually now don't even believe that. I think there are a lot of pastors' kids who are born in that sphere to learn and grow so that they can actually go out into the world and the marketplace and then influence, people there. And of course, I've had my time out there as well, but I was saved at a very young age. I was 9 years old. I still remember like I was in my house. If anybody knows of Carmen, my dad was listening to Carmen at the time. And if you don't get saved by Carmen, then I don't know if you're really saved. So I was just listening to one of the songs and I broke down in tears, didn't really understand what was happening. It was just the lyrics of the song just kind of like spoke to me. And I had an encounter with the Lord, and my dad came in and started trying to figure out what was wrong. And he finally realized what was happening. And so he led me through, a prayer of salvation. And then a couple months later, I was baptized. And as I got a little bit older, especially towards high school, I kind of started deviating away from the church. We were at church 24/7 whenever we weren't at school or doing other shows. And so I kind of grew into this mindset of I don't want to be there because I feel like I'm forced to be there. And so I spent a lot of years just not going. Now, I've always been a believer, and I've always, even though I didn't necessarily walk closely with Christ all the time, I always knew that he was there kind of guiding and leading and things like that. My husband's also a believer. And it wasn't until we moved to Austin in 2015, my husband and I were married in 2002. And we hadn't been in church the whole time that we had been married. We would go occasionally. We were what they call the Creasters. We would come on Christmas or Easter and stuff like that. But we moved down to a town. We didn't have any friends. We didn't have any family down there. And so I started feeling a tug that like, hey, we need to start going to church. And so we started going to church regularly, seeking a church that we could, that we both liked and we felt like the family could be planted into. And it was during one of those visits that I was just sitting there, and people had said stuff to me over the years of like, oh, it would be cool for you to be up singing. And I'm like, yeah, that'll never happen. And then I was sitting there one morning watching the worship team, and I just felt the Lord say, that's what I want you to do. I want you to lead worship. And of course, we haven't talked about this yet, but I had a previous vocal injury and wasn't able to sing at that time. So I kind of was like, okay, you're crazy. And that will never happen. And the Lord kind of worked that out over a couple of struggles of a few years. And now here we are.
So I think it's really cool. And God is cool. He does those cool things that you got saved through music. It's like, he knew, before he formed you in your mother's womb, he knew the purpose for your life. He knew your destiny. And so, and I do believe that he gives us signals, through life. Now, whether we notice them or not, really depends on how closely we're walking with God and how passionately we're seeking his will. But he gave you a sign, your salvation came through a song, through music. Yeah. And so that is very, very powerful. And so you had a vocal injury. What did it feel like not being able to sing since you enjoyed singing? Was that something that really weighed heavy on your heart?
Yeah, it took me several years to kind of process through everything that was happening. So again, I was just touring and doing things like that, pursuing a record deal. And I guess I got nodules so bad in my throat that I had gone to the doctor and they were like, you're going to need surgery. It's so bad that you're going to have surgery, which means you can't talk for 6 weeks. You can't sing for over a year. And just at that mind stage, I was about 18, 19 years old. And I was just thinking, oh man, the kind of money that it's going to take to go through the process. And then normally when you're touring and record labels are watching and stuff like that, if you take time off, you're kind of booted out. They just kind of move on to the next person. And so in my mind, I had just decided, well, if I'm going to have to take that much time off and I'm going to lose everything anyway, then I might as well just not do the surgery. And that'll just kind of be the end of that part of my life. And so I kind of identified myself that way for a long time, just because that's what I did. If I wasn't in school, then I was doing shows. And so I kind of went through a period where I was, obviously depressed and just trying to figure out, what my life was going to look like. Cause I had everything planned out, previously of what life was going to look like. And so it wasn't going to look that way anymore. And so I had to try to figure out, what do I want to do for work? Where do I want to be? What do I want my life to look like? And so just spent some time kind of not in a great place. I definitely wasn't walking closely with the Lord. I didn't blame him, but at the same time, I just was kind of in that I don't understand how he could let this happen if this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I was just a little angry. Like I said, I didn't blame him and think that it was his fault, but I just didn't understand why he would let that happen. So, just grew up, got married, worked, started having kids. And
didn't sing that whole time.
Didn't sing that whole time. Now, I will say that, so when my vocal injury happened and I had to stop singing, that was around 2000. And in 2005, I went back to one of the places that I used to do shows. I took my mom for Mother's Day. And I sang just one set that weekend. And everybody tried to get me to start doing it again. The place that we were at, they were like, you need to start coming back. And I couldn't. There was no, I just didn't have any strength in my voice. I hadn't sang for 5 years. I could tell there were still issues. And so I just was like, no, this isn't something that I'm going to be able to do on a regular basis. So I'm just going to have to not do it. So that was difficult. It was hard.
And so here you are sitting in a church that you just recently started to attend, and God speaks to you and calls you to worship, which is not the way you envisioned your singing career. My understanding, you had rather secular plans for your singing career, but it almost seems like God had to take charge of your plans to direct you exactly where he wanted you to be. So what happened next? How did your voice come back? How did you start singing again?
Well, it took a lot of arguing with God, which you never win when you do that. So, I started just investigating with the churches. I kind of reached out to the church that we were going to, but I also kind of felt in my spirit that wasn't the church we were supposed to be at. So I kind of talked to my husband and just said, hey, I don't think this is where we're supposed to be. So we're going to keep looking if that's okay. And so he agreed. And I shortly after that found a church. The second I walked in, it was like, this is it. This is where you need to be. And so again, I kind of immediately started reaching out, just like, hey, how do I get involved in the worship team? And honestly, when I first received that call to be in ministry and do worship, I really felt like it was more of you're just going to get up and sing. I didn't really envision what the entire thing was going to encompass, which is probably a good thing, because I heard a saying one time that a pastor said, God speaks to us in sentences instead of paragraphs, because if he told us the whole thing, we would probably back out. And so,
true.
Just coming from a performing background, just thinking, oh, I'm just getting up there and singing, that didn't bother me. It's like, oh, okay, I can do that. If, at the time I didn't think I could, but I wasn't intimidated with just standing up in front of people. It was like, oh, okay, that's easy. So I started, investigating how to get involved, and they told me that there was an audition coming up. And so I went and auditioned, and it was the worst thing I think I have ever done in my life. It was so embarrassing. It was terrible. It sounded bad. It was awful. Because by this time I hadn't sang in like 15 years. And so I was so embarrassed. And they emailed me back, and they were like, well, there's like these things that are wrong and these things that are wrong and these things that are wrong. But if you want to start coming and watching us do rehearsals every week, why don't you come and start spending time with the team? And so I just kind of took that as okay, let's just see how this goes. And so I would go and I would, just kind of get to know them and stuff like that. And they had me, evaluate again, like 3 or 4 months later, and they added me to the team. By this time, I could still tell that I had issues with my voice. And so I was still kind of struggling with this whole thing, but just trying to be obedient in what I thought God was telling me to do. And then over the next few years, we ended up moving back up to Dallas and getting involved with Gateway had a great training program for people. And so I really sat down with the Lord and just said, okay, if this is what you want me to do, and not work in the corporate world anymore, if you really want me to go into ministry and do worship, I don't have time or money to pay for a surgery on my throat, because again, I would be out for a year. And I'm like, it just doesn't make sense. So if this is something that you want me to do, then I am asking you to take care of the physical aspect of what the issues that I'm having. And if there are nodules there, then I need that to be healed. So I just kind of started getting involved with Gateway's training program and stuff like that, which taught me techniques to help preserve and not injure my voice any further. And over the next couple of years, I just felt there was a lot of like any of the problems that I was having went away. And I could tell that there was a lot of strength and endurance and stuff that was being built through that training program. And I could see a shift in like my vocal range and just my ability just in general vocally. And so that I literally just have to attribute to the Lord's healing, because I never went and had the surgery done. And I'm just very careful now. If I'm sick or I'm feeling bad, I try not to push through it. I really take that carefully so that I'm not actually injuring something in the future.
I think this is an absolutely extraordinary story. I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because it brings such depth to your worship. It really explains what comes from your heart, because you literally almost a little bit resembles the story of Saul becoming Paul. When you were stripped of your ability to sing, redirected where God wanted you to be, and then had this healing experience to be restored to sing, but now in the capacity that God wanted you to be all along. That's a really, really beautiful story. And the fact that you were healed without any surgery is a huge testament, a huge confirmation of the calling. I love hearing stories like this. And so I think it's also extraordinary that God led you specifically to Gateway Church and their worship program, which is so renowned, so well known all across the country and probably across the world as well. And so what were some of aside from the technical aspect, which was so beneficial to you, how do you feel this program helped you spiritually to become an actual worshiper rather than just a singer, a musician?
Right. So they have played a huge role in my development just spiritually. Of course, in 2018, I enrolled in the King's University, which used to be Jack Hayford's school. It was started by Jack Hayford in California, and then he passed it over to Pastor Robert at Gateway Church several years ago. And so I enrolled in school there doing worship as my degree. And they do focus on the technical side of it, because they do have to make sure that everybody is technically trained, that they are graduating. But they are so much more focused on the heart of why you're doing it, and whether you are leading in a capacity in a church with a pastor's title or not a pastor's title or outside. The whole point is to teach you the deep roots of what worship means. It's a huge talk in the worship world today that, worship is thought of as a 20-minute church experience every Sunday morning. And that's not what it is. That word is something that we've turned it into something that it's not. And so Gateway has been a huge influence in my life as far as what does the word worship mean? What does that look like as far as your life, not just in music, but then also in music as well? How do you lead people well? How do you teach them what it means to worship, both in a worship corporate service and personally in their own lives, which is something that you have to spend time with people. We always say 10% of a worship leader's job is on the platform. The rest of it is pastoring and shepherding and leading people off of the platform. And so they've been a huge influence in that aspect. Zach Neese wrote a book years and years ago called How to Worship a King, which is not meant for worship leaders specifically. And it has been the most profound book of my life that I think I've ever read. And there's been several after that, but that was one of the things that really started teaching me, like, what does worship to God, your creator, really look like? Because everybody is created to worship him. And just because you can't sing or you can't play an instrument doesn't mean that you can't do that. Everything that we do is worship to him. So if you're a teacher, the way that you teach people or teach kids or whatever, the way that you serve those people is your worship to God. If you are a banker, then the way that you serve the people that come in that you're dealing with on a daily basis and how you treat them and how you talk to them and the people that you work with and stuff like that, that's worship. Singing a song, yes, it can be worship, but if your heart's not in the right place, then you're just singing a song or you're just playing an instrument. You have talented musicians, but not every musician can be a worship leader. If they don't, it's all about the heart and how that posture is whenever you're doing it.
So if you were to describe the essence of worship in one or two words, what would that be?
I think because I've been around Gateway for so long, I think Pastor Robert does a great way of explaining it. And the way that he explains it is love expressed. When you worship something, you're expressing what it's worth to you. And so I think those two words are well paired to explain that, because it is. Worship is just like if you're telling your spouse, I love you, and you're doing things to express that, the traditional vows, they've all been changed now because everybody writes their own, or even the traditional ones that we say now don't have these words, but the old traditional marriage vows used to say, with my body, I thee worship. And it didn't mean like worshiping like an idol, but again, you're using everything in your being to express what that person means to you. And so I think, like I said, I just think that I don't know that I can explain it any better than that. I think he does a great job. And so I would just echo what he says.
I think that's a fantastic explanation. I absolutely loved what you said and obviously what Pastor Robert said. And so I've been feeling, and maybe it's a sensitive subject, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, since we're having this conversation, that some of the more recent worship music, the songs, the lyrics are less about worshiping God, more about expressing our personal feelings. Like they seem selfish. Do you think there is a bit of a trend?
Yeah, I think we've gone through different phases. And I do think that there's extremes to both sides. We can sing only about God and who he is, and that's great. Those are things that we need to recognize, because that reminds us, it gives us a right estimation of who we are and who he is. It reminds us that he is so much higher than we are, and that we really can't get low enough. There's no way that we can get low enough to express that we're not worthy to him. Then we have songs that talk about like what he's done in our lives. And I think those are also important, because when those go back to like testimony moments. Testimonies are things that help change people's lives, because God can encounter somebody and change their life no matter whether you're telling a story or not. But the reason that we have testimonies is because there's people out there that may be opposed to the idea of God. And, maybe they've been treated badly before. And so they are, turned off by church and believers and things like that. And it's the testimony of people, things that they've gone through and things that he's done for them that end up softening those hearts and kind of help bring those back. Like I said, God doesn't need us, but it's always great when he can partner with us and we can be vessels to kind of help reach those people. That's our job, right? Is to reach the people that don't know him or have turned away. And so I feel like there is also an extreme of songs that is very us focused. And those are the ones that we have to be careful, maybe throw them in every once in a while, but we've gone to where a lot of them are that way. And I don't know that necessarily it was intentional, but there seems to be constant pendulum swings in the worship world where they're all, very reverent and very vertical. It's what we call vertical songs that we're singing up heavy. And then there's other ones that are far on the other end of the spectrum where they're very us focused. And I think that you have to be careful of those. But then also, like I said, make sure that you are singing stuff that talks about the things that he's done, because it does also talk about power that he has, that like there's things that he does that nobody else can do or you can't do for yourself. And so those things are good to be reminded. But I think you have to have a really good mix where it's really heavy on the singing to God and about God and who he is and things like that, with some of the testimony type of stuff mixed in.
That makes sense. And I love what you said about the power of our personal testimony. And this is literally the theme of the series that we're doing on this podcast right now, Changed Lives, Change Lives. I mean, the greatest tool that we have in our life is our personal testimony of what God has done for us. There's nothing else that we can tell better, and there's nothing else that will impact someone else other than your personal story of what God has done. And so from that perspective, have you had an experience or an encounter that where your personal experience of what God has done for you helped you perhaps touch or change a life of someone else?
I think there's probably multiple times. I mean, the healing of my voice isn't going to reach everybody, because not everybody has been in a situation where they've needed some type of healing. And honestly, I don't even think of myself as a person when they're like a physical healing type thing. I don't think of it that way, but I mean, it's true.
It is.
But not everybody needs something like that. So the other thing about our testimonies is that your testimony is specific to certain people that you're going to encounter. Somebody who hasn't experienced things like you have they might hear it and be inspired, but they're not going to relate to it on the same level as somebody who's gone through something very similar to you. So like several years ago, my husband and I actually almost ended up divorced because he had an emotional affair and things like that. And so we had to go through this really long process we had some small group leaders in our lives that stepped in immediately. As soon as I found out, they stepped in, and the guy took him and the woman took me, and they didn't separate us, but they intentionally spent time with each one of us. And, we did some counseling and some things like that. And it was really hard. It took several years of us. And even during that process, there were points where we almost split up. I actually had packed the kids up one day and we had left and weren't going to come home. But it really came down to us having to make that commitment to each other that we weren't going to break that covenant that we had made so many years before. And while he didn't have a physical affair, sometimes an emotional affair can be even harder, because you're connected to somebody in your soul, and if they are emotionally connected to another person, that kind of splits that a little bit. It makes it really hard to recover from, because they're sharing things with somebody else that they shouldn't be sharing. And so now that I've gone through something like that, we can actually relate to people who have had marriage type issues, and we can talk to them and we can tell them experiences that we've had. He can talk to people about things that he had to go to God to and let the Lord deal with him. Even though I felt like I was punished for a long time from one of the churches that we were in, because I had to take time off and stuff like that. And I was like, I don't understand, because he's the one that did something. I didn't do anything wrong. while cheating is never, I don't think it's fair to blame the other person. I also did have to sit down and say, are there things that I've done over the years that have helped kind of wedge us apart? Not that I've done anything wrong or, anything like that, but are there things that I've done that have made him feel less than or him not appreciated, when I did appreciate him? And those are things that I can go to people and say, look, you also can't always blame the other person. You do need to introspect a little bit. And there's probably something that the Lord wants to deal with you about. Not that it gave him the reason to go, but we're all human and we make mistakes. And if I did things to push him away, he's going to feel like I don't want him around. And so those are just levels that we can connect on with other people now. And so I think that each person not only has one testimony, you might have one, I have one that's very specific to my calling, but then I have also others that are going to help me whenever I encounter other people. And you're going to have multiple testimonies throughout your life of hey, he did this, or hey, he did this, and hey, he did this. And each one of those is specific for a certain reason. We have stories of when we didn't have money and $1,000 showing up on our doorstep that we don't even know where it came from, stuffed into a loaf of bread. I mean, it's just crazy stuff that we would never even think of. And, all of those things give hope to people who are in different situations. And so I think that those things happen so that you have testimonies for different situations of hey, you can trust him. He will provide. Or you can hope. You don't have to assume that this relationship is damaged and it's bad, because it can be turned around. And you don't have to think that just because you're sick or just because you have this thing that's going on that God can't take care of it, because he can.
Very true. And in your case, well, as in case of everyone, I think our testimonies also give depth to our worship, because when we express our love to God, as you explained so well what worship is, remembering how he saw us through these experiences adds depth to our love and to the expression of our love. So thank you so much, LeAnn, for sharing your story, being really transparent about it. It's an incredible story, and I know that it will inspire our listeners. I look forward to hearing your worship at the conference in just a few months, and it will have a whole new meaning to me now, knowing where God brought you through. So thank you again.
Yeah, if I can just say one last thing, I think that something that I would want everybody to know is to just trust the Lord. There's the passage in the Bible that trust in the Lord with all of your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. And a lot of people, they say it, but it really doesn't sink. It's head knowledge, but it's not heart knowledge. And the reason that I would say that is because, thinking back to when I was touring and doing all that stuff, and I was thinking that I was going to, do music, and then I had the vocal injury. I will say that several years ago, I went on a women's retreat, and we were spending some quiet time with the Lord, and they were asking us to ask God what his name for you is, because we all have a name that we don't know yet. And while I didn't get a specific name, I did get a word. And I felt like the Lord told me that the vocal injury that happened when I was younger was done on purpose, because I was taking my giftings and my talents that he had given me, and I was heading in a direction that wasn't going to be healthy, and it wasn't giving glory to him. While people do recognize that talent and stuff is given from the Lord, if you look at secular music industry, there's a lot of bad stuff that ends up happening. And I think that what he was trying to tell me was that I was taking all of that stuff and heading in a direction that was going to be detrimental to me. And it also was not being used for what he gave it to me for. And so doing the injury and being able to make that split of thinking that that was never going to happen again, and then him calling me to worship 15 years later, and then healing and having all that stuff happen, I am doing what I thought I would be doing, but it looks different. But it's 100 times more rewarding. No, it's not flashy. I don't have millions of dollars, but I enjoy it so much more. What I get out of it and what fulfills me deep in my soul is so much better. And then the people that I'm influencing them for a better reason, not just because I might sing good or, have a flashy show. And so it's so easy later on to look back and say, oh yeah, God's plans are always better than what we think and stuff like that. But when you're in that hard moment where you're trying to lean on what you have planned and what you think should happen and stuff like that, it doesn't look that way. It always looks like that in hindsight. So it's going to be kind of cliche-ish, but like I said, I think my message would just be to trust what He is doing, listen carefully, and be obedient, even if it doesn't make sense, because eventually it will.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a great word to end our interview, and I look forward to seeing you in just a few months.
You are worthy of it all. You are worthy of it all. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. You are worthy of it all. You are worthy of it all. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. There's no one greater than you. And day and night, night and day, let incense arise. Day and night, night and day, let incense arise. Day and night, night and day, let incense arise. Day and night, night and day. And day and night, night and day, let incense arise. Day and night, night and day, let incense. Oh Jesus. Day and night, night and day, let incense arise.
You just heard a clip from LeAnn's worship, and I hope you were blessed by her worship as I have been. Her story shows how God can merge our dreams with His plan to give us a fulfilled and blessed life. We're all created to worship. Through worship, God can truly change our lives. At World Missions Alliance, we believe that changed lives change lives. If you would like to learn more about what we do and how you can become involved and discover your greater purpose, I encourage you to visit our website, rfwma.org. If you enjoy this podcast, I encourage you to consider supporting us. You can give it very easily at rfwma.org/forward-give, and any contribution is a big blessing and will help us to continue to reach people across the world with the message of Christ. Thank you for listening to this episode. Until next time, I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit Podcast is produced by World Missions Alliance. We believe that changed lives change lives. If you want to see your life transformed by Christ's love, or if you want to help those who are hurting and hopeless and discover your greater purpose in serving Christ through short-term missionary work, check out our website, rfwma.org, and find out how to get involved.